recording. So let us look through these slides to the basic concepts of research, or an introduction to research itself, and look at some of the concepts of research. And then from there, we can hopefully begin to understand what a research problem is, looking practically at these research articles. So let me share my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, madam.
Okay. Now, let us look at the nature and methods of research. Methods of research really is something we shall see much later, but we want to see the nature of research itself. The first question we all must ask ourselves is, what is research? And this is a question that, of course, can be quite confusing. I might say, let us say, if I said I want to find out how to bake a chocolate cake. Let me give an example. The chocolate cake is my most favorite cake ever. So if I said I want to find out how to bake a chocolate cake, and then I go online, I Google it, I go to YouTube, I find a video, and it gives me instructions and I do it. The question is, have I carried out research? If, let us say, I want to find out how to grow maize in a dry environment, and I go and I Google it, I go to class, I go to the library, I go to NADS, and so on and so forth. Am I carrying out research? Is that what we call research? That is a question I would like to pose each one of you. Would that be considered research? Yes, Ogola?
Thank you, Doctor. I think it would, as long as you follow all the scientific methods or methodologies that constitute what a report, what research is.
Okay.
As long as you do it following the research rules, you meet all the parameters, science can qualify to be research.
Okay. Kalule, what
Yes,
is your
please.
thoughts?
I think it is not a research because you're already following the steps, what you know already. So I think it's not a research.
Yeah, Kalule is extremely right. That's the process, let's say, of baking a chocolate cake. If I don't know, it's me who doesn't know, but there's somebody else that knows. Yeah. One of the most important things that we must remember from the discussion we had last week, research must be bringing new knowledge to a research community. And this I'm going to emphasize over and over and over again until we get it. It must be bringing new knowledge to a research community. So in other words, there's a certain research community that must have pointed out, this is the research, this is something that is unknown to us. Okay, so Dennis, I would go back to that article on information and communication and look for what the authors were saying, what had been unknown to others. That should be the issue. That is where the research problem lies. Okay, so it's not just a matter of saying, oh, as long as we follow the research method. No, the first and foremost important thing is that there must be a research problem. That research problem shouldn't be just for you. It should be noted elsewhere in a certain research community that ABCD is known, it's X, Y, and Z that is unknown. Nobody has gone to ask to answer this question. So when we look at some of the definitions of research, a systematic inquiry. Now, when I talked about going out to find the recipe of how to bake a chocolate cake, yes, it's an inquiry, and of course, it is a systematic inquiry because I'm taking certain steps to make that inquiry. Then it says, which is reported in a form that allows the research methods and outcomes to be accessible to others. Now, who would I be reporting it to? The world already knows, or several people already know how to bake that cake. So who would I report it to? Remember, your inquiry is going to make a report to others. And that report is adding knowledge to others. Okay, so it should be something that is unknown to others. So therefore, it necessitates you reporting. Now, if I am baking a chocolate cake, I'm not going to go and report to others because it's already known. I might even report to others and they even know a better recipe than what I know. Okay? So when we talk about seeking solutions, we are talking about solutions that are needed by a certain community, not just by you. Okay? Not just by you. And you should be seeking solutions to problems or answers to meaningful questions. Okay? So what are the meaningful questions? Let's see what are the non-meaningful questions. And here, this is where I want to emphasize. A non-meaningful question is where I can actually Google the answer. If I can Google the answer, then does it need research? If I can find the answer on YouTube, then there's nothing to discover about it. That is one. Two, the meaningful answer indicates that you will accept that that whatever answer you get from that question, you'll accept it. Whatever answer you get, you'll accept it. That means even if it's a negative answer, it is accepted as appropriate. Take an example. The researchers, the scientists who are trying to discover the vaccine for COVID during that time of 2020, 2021, when we were in lockdown, when the whole world, especially 2020, when they were in lockdown, and they were trying to discover, and they were carrying out experimental laboratory tests. I'm sure they tried several things and they got a negative answer, and that answer was reported as an answer, and it was accepted. Yeah, it was accepted. Why is it important that you report that negative answer? So that the next scientist doesn't bother trying that route. The one who is going to add on knows that this route actually doesn't produce results. Now, this is very important, especially for our IS students who are very much leaning towards developing systems. When we're IT people, we want to develop systems and we want to say it works. We want to insist this thing works. Okay? Now, in research, your system functionally may work, but remember, when we're talking about IS research, we must know that we must understand in which field, professional field we belong. Eh? We have computer science, we have IT and IS, we have those in artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. Now, when you're talking about computer science professionals, those are the people who are completely separated from the social context. Yeah, those who work separate from the social context. IS, sometimes we imagine we are computer scientists, but we are not. IS professionals are not computer scientists. Now you're bringing a technology into a context. So when you bring it into a context, the context is part of your system or your application. So like in the research that Dennis points out, an application was brought into a context and it didn't work, and the negative result was reported. So the key thing is to understand that your meaningful question should allow you to accept whatever answer that is brought, whether it's negative or positive. You don't start the research knowing the answer. Okay? You don't start the research with already knowing the answer. Then that's not research. Now,
it could be research.
How could it be research if you already know the answer? How do you know the answer? Before even you do the research, how can that be possible?
Mm-hmm.
I was listening, actually. Yes, please.
I could be finding alternative methods. Like, for example, I can say, give an answer, maybe it is Kampala, but I know the route is from Jinja. I need to find another route which take me to Jinja, to Kampala. So I do research when I'm finding a different solution of getting the similar, of having a similar goal.
Now, the first thing I want to emphasize, when we're doing research, we start with a question. And a question of which we don't have an answer. Then once we have the question, we set an objective. Now, this is something IS people and IT people are very familiar with, setting an objective. I'm going to design a system, blah, 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 blah. But the system, by designing that system, at the end, you'll be answering a question. Does this system actually respond to the problem? And the answer is either yes or no. So it's never possible that you have an answer immediately. Interestingly, I was listening to, it was a religious a talk, but the speaker responded related it to science. The speaker is somebody who died many years ago. He was called Archbishop Fulton Sheen. And he related to, he was relating the issue of obedience to growing in wisdom and knowledge. And specifically, he pointed to the scriptures in the Bible where Jesus, as a young boy at 12 years, when his mother and foster father found him, and they said to him, when he disappeared from them, and they said to him, why did you, we've been looking for you. And then he explained to them, I was at my father's business. And then he said, the scripture says he followed them and he was obedient and he grew in stature and wisdom and in favor with God and man. So this speaker goes ahead to say, obedience is important in gaining wisdom and knowledge. I said, he gave the example of a scientist. He said, a scientist who is observing nature, unless he or she submits to the fact that he or she doesn't know and allow nature to reveal itself to him or her, he or she will never find the answer. So when I think of these words, it points me back to research itself. You start the research not knowing the answer. You start the research not knowing the answer. Now, Dennis, you gave an example that, let's say you know the route from Kampala to Jinja, but you want to find an alternative route. Now, Dennis, then if you're doing proper research, you would start with a research question saying, you start the research question saying, let's say, what alternative routes exist from Kampala to Jinja? Okay, what alternative routes exist between, other than the route you mentioned, the route that you know? And then you're going to carry out a research to find out an alternative route. Now, your research may find an alternative route, your research may find there is no other route. If it's proper research, there may be an alternative route, there may be none. If it's proper research, you will give an objective answer that either there's no other alternative route, that's the only route, or that there is actually a route. There's maybe one or two more routes. So you start with a research question, then you set an objective, and that once that objective is, you carry out that objective should give you an answer at the end of it all. Yes, Eddie, you have a question.
Yes, doctor.
Yes.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Could you please talk about the hypothesis testing?
We are going to talk about hypothesis in detail. There's a whole lecture on that. For now, let us focus on the first most basic concepts, because they are also extremely important. But there's a whole lecture on that.
Hypothesis testing.
No, the hypothesis, whether you're doing qualitative research, quantitative, are you going to do hypothesis? Are you going to do research question? All of that. Eh?
I just wanted to know how it is linked to the solution.
Now, for that, first thing I would ask you, do you know what research approach it's related to?
Let's say
Pardon?
Quantitative.
Aha.
Quantitative
What is the philosophical thinking behind it?
Philosophical thinking. Ethnography.
Ethnography is a research method.
A research method.
Yeah.
Phenomenology.
That is another approach.
Isn't it a research philosophy?
No, it's another research approach. What I would suggest, Eddie, let's go step by step, because we have quite a number of things to go to before we get to hypothesis. And for somebody else who has not heard of it, this, for me to start talking about it, may confuse others. So let's go step by step. Eh? One of the most important things, Eddie, I want us to understand is a research problem. Let us not just, we especially for IS students, we really need to come out of this idea of saying, oh, there is a problem here, maybe in reporting. Let me create a system, and that's research. No, that's a project. That's not research.
Projects.
Yeah.
Yes,
you wrote projects at undergraduate level. You're now at master's.
Yes.
Yeah, you're now at master's level. We expect you to be academic, and research is what makes you academic. So we are beyond the IT, the undergraduate level. We now want to go beyond just creating systems for the sake of saying, oh, I'm really good at programming. You know, Eddie, there are people who have never gone to school and are very good at programming. Extremely good. So what's the difference between you and that person who never went to school? The difference is that you are an academic. And what makes you an academic is research. That's the objective of this module. To separate you from that person who says, I can code without going to school. I hope I'm making, I hope I'm driving forward a point.
Yes.
Yeah, we need to know we are different from, you hear, I saw a message for something said by the NSSF CEO, where he said he doesn't care anymore about first-class degrees, that he has people who can code without even going to school. So if the CEO of NSSF can say he's no longer interested in your degree, how are you going to separate yourself from everyone else? How? Yeah. There is, let me just speak to the ICT students. There's a colleague of mine, he was actually a former student in the class of MSc ICT. It's called Joseph Wemema. Yeah. Joseph Wemema recently got a job with VitalWave. I forget the title, but essentially he's an expert in enterprise architecture. And he asked me to be a referee. He's one of his referees. And so after he was giving me feedback, he was offered a job at I think it should now be at $10,000 per month. And he doesn't code. One of his strongest points is that he's a researcher. That is one of his greatest strengths. Yeah, so the most important thing you can get out of this module is to become a researcher, to be an academic, not just developing systems. That's what we want to, that's the point I would really like to bring forward. Now, we want to come to some of the concepts, and you've raised some of these things.
Excuse me, Doctor.
Eddie? Yes, please.
Doctor, maybe before we proceed, I'm just speaking to the from the point you made that you can't begin a research with an answer already, like when you already know an answer. And I don't know, I want to just give maybe to ask with a scenario. Yes, I want to take I'm in the financial services sector. And let me say I work with Bank of Uganda. And I know there is maybe something that BOU has implemented, and as maybe let me say it's a policy or it is a regulation that BOU has pushed to all the commercial banks. Now, from where I sit as someone that works with BOU, I probably already know that this is not working fine as someone that is within BOU. And maybe not everyone out there knows the loopholes that I know. Would it be right for me to develop a research topic in that area with an essence of spreading to everyone else that doesn't know what I know?
Okay.
Would that be a contribution to the research community?
Now,
would it be a valid contribution?
Okay, now Ogola, I think that your question is coming from, I think, one of the most essential areas of where we begin to identify research problems. Normally, from our surroundings, we begin to see issues. We begin to see issues that are affecting a certain sector. Now, for the example you've given is you are at BOU and there's a certain policy that is being pushed down towards the commercial banks, but you know it doesn't produce the desired results. Yeah. So Ogola, my advice there would be begin by going to literature. Okay. That our lecture tomorrow, hoping that we can finish today's lecture very well, our lecture tomorrow should be on literature review. Start by going to literature to read about that problem. What are other authors saying about it? Yeah. Has another researcher seen that problem and gone to find out what those loopholes are? and in what context was he or she researching? How much research has been done about it? So far, what is known and what is unknown? And then you say, okay, depending on what solution, maybe someone could have said, maybe it's because there's this lack of framework and I'm proposing it. And then you say, okay, let me test it out and see if it will close the gaps. Another person might say, we haven't yet, maybe the research might say, we haven't discovered why these policies don't work. And then you say, okay, my research is going to find out why these policies are not working. I don't know if you're getting what I'm trying to say. You observe it in your context, you go back to literature, the research community, yeah, you find out what they are saying about it. Now, you might find there's actually no research has been done about it, okay? Or you may find a research has been done about it, but focusing on only one area and not another. And then now your objective is to bring forward that group of people who have researched about it, new knowledge from your perspective.
Oh, yes.
Yes,
okay.
yeah. So we can start by identifying where we are, but we first go back to literature to find out what has been observed, what has been done about it. If there's been nothing written about it, can I find out why? Can I report back why this thing doesn't work? And what am I proposing? You know, things like that. Eh?
Okay, it addresses my fear because I think it's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, let me see if there's a question. Okay, so Maweja was also giving a response. So let us look at some basic concepts that that drive research. We are going to look at some philosophies. We're going to look at specific. These are the two major philosophical viewpoints that we're going to look at. But however, we shouldn't put ourselves in a box. Okay. We want to first start with research philosophies. These research philosophies are related to approaches. Then we come to strategy or method. But this, I want to leave it for another day when I go deep into methods, research methods. Looking at a multi-method approach or combining approaches. We want to look at research credibility and ethics of research. So let us start with some of the basic concepts of research. And we start with philosophy, research philosophy. And we find two major research philosophies. Now, why do we have this image we have here? Sometimes we hear people talk about the research onion. The research onion basically tells us the things that are supposed to be at the back of our head guiding us as we carry out our research. When we are carrying out research, imagine you're going to do anything in life. There's something, first of all, you must have some guiding principles. Something that guides you on how you're going to start your day. Take an example when you wake up, first thing you do in the morning, there is a philosophy that guides each one of us. Although we might name it, we might not name it. You hear people talk about, this is my philosophy of life. Someone might say, me, I don't have a philosophy. But in actual sense, we all have some guiding principles. They guide us in everything that we do. For example, one person may wake up and the first thing they do is look for alcohol. Another person may look for drugs. That is your philosophy. You need a stimulus to get you going. In other words, you Do not want to rely on anything else but stimulating your senses. Another person wants to start immediately by working. Immediately, I have to work. I have to get up. I can even get up and start reading a book and start with work even before I eat something. For me, it's work, 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 work. Another person will say, for me, first start with prayer. Another one will say, I have to first greet the people around me. Another one will say, no, I must have a shower. I must have a bath. Make sure my hair is combed. I have put on some lipstick or something like that. You have something that guides you. So also with this research, there is something that guides you on how you're going to approach a certain problem. Then we have our research approaches. Sometimes you hear people call, say, research design and the procedures that we want to take. And the procedures, what kind of procedures do I want to take? Then we have our research strategies, are sometimes referred to as research methods. Yeah. We have our time horizon. For how long do I want this research to go on? Of course, some things are dictated upon. For example, you're going to, this is your master's research. Why we're doing this module is, first of all, to guide you with your master's research. You have a very limited time. But then there are those people who do longitudinal research. For example, I have read like articles, like for example, on BBC, research which follows maybe children, their development from a certain age to a certain age. That is longitudinal research, where this group of scientists are collecting data maybe on a group of children from the time maybe they are 1 to the time when they are maybe 5 or 6 years old. And they are collecting data throughout. So that is longitudinal research. So it depends really on what type of research, on what you're doing and how you're doing. Then in the innermost part of our onion, we have our data collection methods. Or sometimes I like to interchange the word methods with tools, because many times when I'm talking to students I'm supervising, when you ask what's your research method, they tell you interviews or questionnaires. No, those are tools. Your research method is different from your data collection tool. Two completely different things. So this is the research onion. So you start with the philosophy, which is the guiding principles, some of your guiding principles. So let us start with our research philosophies. So now, when we begin to read about them, and as soon as this lecture ends, I'm going to upload, I think, 3 chapters which I extracted from other books online, which give you some more in-depth on what research philosophies are. You have, mainly when you read in research, you have 2 very distinct and warring camps, and sometimes they become political. I don't know if you've heard of the politics between open source and proprietary, the Linux lovers and the Windows lovers. I'm sure you've had those political discussions. Those who are for open source and those who are against, those who think. I remember I went for a seminar some years back, many years back, and there was such a war between, those who are for open source believed Microsoft was the most corrupt thing that could exist, that was even funding some of the dictatorships in Africa and so on and so forth. It's really a big thing. So sometimes you also see that level of opposition between the 2 main philosophical positions. One is positivism, the other is phenomenology. Yeah, those 2 research philosophies. So where do they differ? Remember, these are guiding principles. Number one is logic. Yeah? All of us have our logic, the way we think, the way we believe, the way we see things move. And each one of us differs in how we think and how we reason things out. I remember I have two siblings. My older sister keeps telling me that, Sheba always thinks she doesn't see gray areas. Something is either right or wrong. She doesn't see any other area. And for sure, that's my thinking. And for her, on the other hand, she feels things. The issue of emotions come in, and she tends to understand somebody who is hurting a lot more than I do. And that's logic. That is how, that's all of that is logic, just that it's a different way of looking at things. So also these two philosophies have different logic, the way they see things. The second is ethics. Ethics is what is considered right and wrong. Yeah? What do we consider right? What do we consider as wrong? Let me give you an example. I don't know if for me, I don't know if you've ever studied the history of development. Has anyone ever studied the history of development? When I talk about development, that means coming from poverty coming from a position of poor, ill-being to well-being. The difference between Uganda and America, that kind of thing. Has anyone ever studied that history? Hello?
Maybe not, Doctor.
No, they've never heard of it. Okay, let me just give just a brief idea of it. Now, the subject of development, of course, comes about when the developed world looks at the developing world. When the UN and IMF and all these and World Bank, when they come in to look at, let's say, places like Ethiopia, when they look at Somalia and they say, no, these are places of ill-being, we must bring them up to standard of living. And you hear things like this number of people in Somalia live on less than $1 a day. This number of people in Uganda live on less than $1 a day. I remember I think earlier this year when we were coming out of lockdown, we came out of lockdown, and the President Museveni made a statement that Uganda is now middle income status, and World Bank came out and said, no, we are not. Essentially, what they are using are the economic terms of measuring development, where you measure on how many people are living on less than $1 a day and things like that. Now, all this the idea behind it is to measure poverty or development in terms of money. Yeah, measuring poverty in terms of money. So that there was that original ethics of measuring poverty in terms of money, and there were all these strategies to fight poverty in terms of okay, let's industrialize. We had Museveni talking about industrialize, and so on and so forth. And then there were other arguments saying, no, it's not just about industrializing. Let's build structures. Let's build the education sector. Let's build the healthcare sector. Let's build infrastructure and things like that. And you actually see those things coming in. World Bank is now funding road construction. Seven is now inviting investors to come and build hospitals and so on and so forth. You know, that's that kind of thinking. Then you hear things like measuring income levels, how many people are living on less than $1 a day, how many people are near schools, how many people are near a hospital, how many kids, what is the infant mortality rate, things like that. So then there were that kind of thinking where you begin to measure based on what the developed world is thinking. There were other people who came up and said no. When you start measuring according to the Western world, you're not being fair. And there were people. There was a man whom I read, is called Chapman, who wrote a paper saying whose reality counts. And here he was bringing a different ethical thinking, saying that you can't start measuring somebody as poor, yet you haven't asked them if they believe they are poor. And that ethical thinking actually came out because there was a story in Western Africa where a development worker came and noticed that there were these women who are walking long distances to fetch water. And these development workers decided to build a borehole near them. And after they built it and put it there, they realized no one was fetching water from that borehole. When they tried to find out why, they found out that these women used that time, they treasured the time when they used to walk long distances, because they said in that time they would talk about their problems. In that time they would find out which woman was actually being beaten at home, who went hungry last night, and things like that. So you realize that the measurements that the developed world or the academic people bring forward as this is what is right and this is what is wrong didn't apply to them. So now you see, now those were different ethical guidelines. All these people are looking at development, and none of them is wrong. No, none of them is wrong, but the what is considered right and wrong for both is quite different. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's where I'm trying to bring forward a different logic, a different ethical thinking. The next is epistemology. This is where the philosophers differ, is how we know. How do we know this is right? How do we know that this is wrong? Yeah? How do I know that when I arrive at this answer, this is the correct answer? Remember, research is about answering a question, but how do I know this would be the correct answer? How do I know that if I use this line of thought, it will give me the correct answer? Yeah, take an example. The issue of the borehole, it was an issue of distance. Well, another person didn't look at the social structures that these women go about as they walk long distances together, gossiping, telling each other stories, the things that we enjoy as women. There are things women enjoy that we discuss. You know, I've had issues. I've quarreled with my friend. I quarreled with my mother-in-law, and things like that. You know, I'm not happy with this. You know, that kind of thing. That I am willing to walk a long distance so that I can have that conversation. So that, imagine how this other one researcher was looking at distance, the other one was, another researcher is looking at, let me discuss and see what is of importance, whose reality counts. How do I know with the problem I'm trying to research which would be the best approach for me to use? Then the last one is ontology, the study of being. What is it that I'm trying to study? Is it an objective mind, an independent reality, that when I say I'm going to count this number of people, if this number of people say this, that is the reality? Or where I say the reality of being socially constructed, like the situation of the women walking, the study of being. So we have two approaches. We have two major philosophical positions. The first is positivist. So this one deals with things that are quantifiable, positive facts, things that are observable. Yeah? Things that are quantifiable, things, facts that we can clearly point out. Now, some people say this is the proper scientific method. Yeah, the proper scientific method, but that is not necessarily true. That is simply a different way of seeing things. So when we say the scientific fact is, imagine the infectious disease viral researchers who are trying to study the COVID-19 virus. They were trying to study the structure, they're trying to study its behavior and how it would react towards the different COVID vaccines that came up with, so that different scientists came up with. So that scientist is going to look at numbers. I apply this vaccine, this is the effect. I apply the other vaccine, this is the effect. And I pull out these positive facts. This was maybe 10% effective, the other one was 20%, the other one was 1.0, the other, those are positive facts that you're pointing out. You're pointing out something quantitative in terms of quantities. You're drawing your evidence in terms of something that is measurable. So the primary goal is not only to describe, but also to predict and explain. That's the primary goal, to describe, to predict, and to explain. To describe what is the causal effect, to what point. So the other total opposite is phenomenology. Yeah? So phenomenology is dealing with experience. It deals with experience, how we experience things, whose reality counts. We want to say that each phenomena is unique. Each situation is unique. And whatever variables we find here may not be found elsewhere. What makes me content is not what makes, for example, Eddie content. What makes my young nephew or niece content is not what makes me content. My culture, my location will affect my decisions. Quite different from somebody of the same age as me, maybe who lives in Ethiopia, somebody who lives in Dubai, somebody who lives in Qatar, somebody who lives in Rome. Our cultures differ. The times in which I live are very different from the times somebody else lives. So all of that, we have to consider all those things before we can derive an answer on what my response to something is going to be. So essentially, while positivism is considered objective, phenomenology is considered subjective. There was a question. I first wanted to explain this too before I go to the question. There was a hand raised. It was Maweje, I think. Was it Maweje? Somebody had a hand raised.
Yes, Doctor, I had raised my hand. I had wanted you to expound on ontology. Then you moved.
Ontology, on the issue of being. The being, what is it that we are trying to study? Now, Maweje, let's go back to the two examples I had given you. One was we put ourselves in the position, look at the scenario of the COVID-19 scientists who is trying to study how effective the different vaccines are. And he or she in the lab is given, he or she has maybe the different COVID-19 variants, and maybe starts with Moderna and tries to see how effective Moderna is maybe on the very first COVID-19 variant we had. Then you have the Delta. Then we have Omicron. Those are the two I can remember offhand. And he or she tests to see how effective it is in the lab and quantifies maybe from the Petri dish, then puts it in these mice, the mice they use for testing, and quantifies. Then takes it maybe to, what's the next thing? A pig, a guinea pig, tests, quantifies. They started with the very first variant, then goes to the next vaccine, which is the next one, Johnson, tests, and then quantifies. In each of them, it is just a matter of seeing how effective this thing is, how effective it is at producing, let's say maybe, no, sorry, the vaccine produces antibodies. The vaccine produces antibodies. It will be the medication, the medication where you see how effective it is at fighting. So maybe the person is testing with Covidex, and then the other drugs that were being used, there were drugs, I think, which were posted on BBC, I can't remember the names. Maybe they checked on Covidex, they test on this drug, and for each, they see the result. Now here, they are simply pointing, they will simply be pointing out figures, numbers, okay? That is the positive, is the objective one, where you're pointing out figures to point out which drug is most effective, yeah? In the Petri dish, in the mouse, in the guinea pig, or in any other animal they are using, maybe if it's a monkey, how effective it is. Then they'll move from that, they'll even go to people. When we now move the drugs to human tests, to see how effective it is. This person who has the Delta virus, this one who has Omicron, this one who has the original variant. And they report. Now, by the very nature of the virus, its being, the very nature of the research, because we are looking at how effective it is, the nature of its being, that we simply want to see how effective this drug is on this particular variant and in the different hosts. That being itself, we just need to report, the researcher simply needs to report back figures. Yeah, by the very nature of that. Now, change that to something which is now subjective. And here, I would like to point out the article that Dennis read on ICT and ICT information and communication. The first research, if you look at the paper, it points out previous research that had been done on groupware applications. They had all been done in experimental labs. Now, if you are doing it in an experimental lab, you're simply seeing how effective it is at improving communication and information in an experimental lab, in a controlled environment. Then these researchers said, let's put it in an environment that is uncontrolled. That means an actual organization where you have different forces coming up. So in that situation, I remember I read the article, there was an issue about ICT. When the research was starting, the researchers or management didn't involve ICT. And what happened? ICT did not come in to support. That was a subjective situation. that automatically affected the effectiveness of this application within the organization. The very nature of that research, it needed a very different way of looking at things, different from an experimental lab where you have something controlled, where you can simply give a result in terms of quantities. But when you have to bring about how people feel about something, how people feel about something, the reality is different. Okay, that reality is quite different. I'll give an example, and maybe here I would ask those of you in ICT, all of you are in ICT, in the ICT department, in the different organizations where you work. Imagine management brings a system without consulting you in ICT. How would you feel about it? Imagine management decides to implement a system without asking your opinion as the technocrats in the organization. How would you feel about it?
Of course, you feel bad.
Exactly. And most likely it's going to affect your support, because your technical support is needed. So what are the chances? The chances are extremely high that that system will actually fail if there's no support from ICT. What about if you as ICT propose a system without asking the users about user requirements, what actually they need? So here we are saying there are certain things that are there are certain research types where you may need to go into, because feelings and emotions of people, experiences of people are important. How somebody feels about something, it is extremely important. Certain things like location are extremely important. Let me give you an example, okay? I'll give you an example. I've had the opportunity to work in a purely commercial environment. My first job was with Africa Online. I'm sure most of you may not even know what Africa Online is. Before the MTNs, UTLs came in, MTNs, Airtel, and so on and so forth, we had internet service providers. So Africa Online was one of them. And while I was working for them, I was a sales administrator, let me say, in simple terms. And in this company, and I remember originally it had silo systems. The people in accounts, their system was not connected to the people in customer care and ICT, and the people in sales would simply, let's say if a salesperson sold an account to somebody, to a client, he or she could go to accounts and create an account, and the person starts using the service even before it goes to the accounts department. So in other words, there were situations where a system could, a client would have a system, would have an account running with Africa Online, and the accounts department has never billed them. And probably even the salesperson is pocketing that money. So at a certain point, management simply came in and implemented a system which was, seamless. You create the account. The minute you create the account, accounts department starts billing, and until you have paid, the system would not allow you to use the system. Even the system could cut you off if once the system sensed that you hadn't made any payment. And they simply came and imposed it. and there was no argument. And I remember a number of people were fired because they were no longer necessary because of this system. Now, and there was no argument. No one could argue, no one could say anything. You simply went with it. Now, let me just give you a huge difference in culture when I come to with Umu. When you're working in a university environment, it's a very different situation. In the university environment, you have the academic staff, you have the administrative staff. Academic staff, you have your professors, you have your PhD holders, and so on and so forth. Let me tell you something, you can't force a professor to do anything he or she doesn't want to do. Yeah? If a professor says, no, I'm not going to do it, he or she will not do it. And in some universities, you can't even fire them. It's actually impossible in some universities, especially these government universities where professors have tenure. You can't fire them. So it's a completely different culture. So you see now, there where you're looking at system implementation, it becomes a completely different situation. Yeah, it's not a question of let me enforce and it becomes a yes or no situation. So the issue of being Maweje there, the study of being, what is it I'm trying to study? Do I need to get the experiences of people or is it unnecessary? So what it is you're trying to study will determine the philosophical outlook that you will select. Yeah? Maweje, I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yes, doctor, I have picked everything. Thank you.
Okay. Now, where in the positivist approach, we are looking at something quantifiable. In the phenomenology, we are looking at a narrative. Yeah? We are looking at a narrative. Outcome sometimes are descriptions, which are expressed in terms of a narrative. So that's when we hear things like quantitative research and qualitative research. Okay? Those two different approaches. So now that we've looked at the two philosophical approaches, we look at the two philosophical outlooks, we look at the approaches. And these are deductive and inductive. So when we're looking at a positivism philosophical outlook, we're looking at a deductive approach. Yeah? We're looking at a deductive approach, and our research design must follow that approach. Eddie, this is where it was important that we start with understanding the philosophy, we come to the approach, and then we hear things like hypothesis. That's why it is important we start from that perspective. If we're looking at phenomenology, we may look at an inductive approach. So the deductive approach, we normally start with a theory. We have a theory that gives us certain assumptions. Yeah, gives us certain assumptions. For example, I want to ask each one of you to go and read on term theory, the technology acceptance model. Read about it. It gives you certain assumptions, theoretical assumptions on predicting if a system will be adopted or not. And there are other adoption theories. You can also go ahead and research something a bit more on those. For those in the field of ICT, I would suggest look at a theory on alignment, strategy alignment. Look for some theories on strategy alignment. Especially those doing ICT, I should be taking you in a module called ICT strategy. Look for a theory on alignment. Theories give us assumptions. And when they give you assumptions, which assumptions we can use to answer certain questions. So I gave you the example on term. A term is a theory which can help you predict if a technology and application will be adopted or not. And from those assumptions, people develop hypotheses. Okay? They develop hypotheses. So these theories already should exist. They should be in existence. And when we want to answer a certain question, those theories can help us to guide us on how to answer a question, if it's a yes or no question. Then we have the inductive approach. Now, the inductive approach begins by collection of data. And from that data, we begin to develop a theory. Yeah? We begin to develop a theory after we carry out data analysis. There was a comment here. Let me. Oh, so I think, Paweja, I think I answered the question on ontology. So the deductive thinking, we start with a theory. We say, if a theory is true, for example, term, we say, if this theory is true, this theory says X will occur. Then we go about to test X. And we say, does it support it or does it not support? Yeah? Does it support or does it not support? Remember, we said, we go back to what I pointed out at the beginning, we may have an answer, whatever question we pose, we must be able to accept the answer. Okay? We should be able to accept the answer. So Eddie, let me give you an example for you who is really into system development and so on and so forth. You could try something like this out. Okay, that would be something that would be a suggestion for you, where you start with a theory. The theory says, if this theory says X, Y, and Z, and so if it is true, this should occur. Then you test the theory. If it comes out positive, you say it's positive. If it comes out negative, you report that. So this is where the issue of theory testing comes out. So here I give you the example of technology ease of use and technology adoption. So go ahead and read about term. Just read about it. We can have a discussion next time we meet. So the deductive thinking, we essentially start with a theory, which theory gives us a hypothesis. We observe, we confirm. This is just in the simplest way possible. Let's look at the other one, building theory. Yeah. What is the experience of using a particular e-learning system during COVID-19 pandemic? We could say, someone might say that when we had COVID, when we had the COVID-19 situation, I think for most schools, for most universities, the issue of e-learning was alien. Yeah, it was an alien situation. So someone might say, we want to find out the experience of users. And users, when we say users, who do we mean? We are talking about the students, the lecturers. Yeah, students and lecturers. And someone might say, I want to begin to explore the experience of students and learners, the students, learners, and teachers and educators, because this was a relatively new experience. Now, two things I want to point out. In deductive approach, there's a theory that exists. In inductive, there isn't a theory that exists. Most of the time, one of the guiding principles we have, one of the guiding principles we have is normally there's a lot of research that has been done about something. There's a lot of research that has been done. Sorry, Karen, can you mute? Karen Grace, could you mute?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Karen, could you mute?
Yes, please, sister.
Yeah. So one of the things that is kind of being hinted when we're using the deductive approach, we have already a theory and we already have something that is known about it. For example, there's a lot of research that has been done about adoption, ICT adoption, a lot of research. And when I talk about term isn't the only theory. There's several theories that predict adoption, several theories that predict adoption. So in other words, a lot of research has been done on ICT adoption. Yeah. Eddie says DIT, what is DIT? Maybe he'll respond to us later. But a lot of research has been done about it. So when you're doing research on something that, for example, on ICT adoption, on anything, maybe we now want to look at e-learning. Adoption has been done quite a bit. Someone might say, I want to have a positivist approach and look at adoption long-term to predict if there'll be a long-term adoption of e-learning. And somebody says, I'm going to do a study to find out on ease of use of these systems. And they have been using them, first of all, to find out, do the students find Moodle easier to use? Do they find Zoom easier to use? Is it found to be useful? And so on and so forth. And yet then you find in actual sense they don't, but the system is still being used. So therefore, is the theory right or wrong? That question, those questions will rise. And then you might say, okay, maybe further study needs to be done to find out why are these universities still adopting, yet they say Moodle, which is being widely used, is not the easiest thing to use at all. Maybe there are other reasons behind it. So then you can propose for further research. And maybe the next researcher says, let me use an inductive approach where I try to understand why these universities and schools are using these applications, despite the fact that they are not easy to use. And then the person uses an inductive approach because they're going further in their research. They're going to find out the experiences of people. What is it that is motivating them that is beyond ease of use? Okay? What is it that is motivating them that is beyond ease of use? I'll give you another scenario, a practical scenario. I usually give this example in most of my lectures. Most of you have heard about female genital mutilation or female circumcision. And most of you may know that several countries, including Uganda, have outlawed the practice. But however, despite the fact that the practice has been outlawed, the fact that there has been massive sensitization, this practice still occurs. Yeah, it still occurs, and interestingly enough, it is being promoted by women themselves. I saw a documentary where there was a woman who reached adulthood and she had never gone through female circumcision, and she was educated, she was a teacher, and then she made a decision to go ahead and be circumcised. And anyone who has talked about it, the experience, it's a horrible experience. And for some people, they have long-term side effects to it. You know, they have very painful menstrual periods. They have very difficult births when they're trying to give birth to children. And I saw a program where there are children as young as 6 years old, and it's horrible. It's really, really horrible, a different situation. So the question that was being asked is, why are women still going back? And then researchers decided to go and do ethnographic research, where ethnographic research method is where people go and spend time with a community. They stay with them, they live with them, just to try and find out what is the reasoning behind it. So you found there were different reasons of why a woman says, I didn't feel I was part of this community and I needed to belong. I did not feel I would get married unless I carry out this act. So you see that the motivating factors behind them were beyond feeling pain and horrible menstrual periods. But in that situation, an inductive approach needed to be used. Also, Eddie was telling us diffusion of innovation theory. Thank you, Eddie, for that one. So the inductive approach, basically, it tries to understand, to interpret the world based on the different perspectives of people. Yeah, the different perspectives. To find out the narratives, people give their own stories. Again, going back to that question of whose reality counts. Now, someone may think, for us ICTIS, where would this come in? It would. There was, I read one time a paper, an IS paper, where researchers used ethnography to find out why a system was being accepted or not being accepted within certain organizations. So in other words, they were saying that each organization has its different cultures. Each organization has a culture. They have reasons why they do things. They have the ways in which they work. Take an example. I think one time I went to one of these Google shoot-offs. The way their office was set was completely different from, let's say, from the academic environment at UMU. Completely different environment, because Google has its own culture as an organization. So yeah, even in IS research, some of these methods come into work quite well. So the inductive approach really looks at context and says context matters. Yeah, context matters. So let me give an example of Angola. If you gave the example of Angola, I hope you're there. Just maybe to give you more guidance on the issue that you had raised of Bank of Uganda, that you have a policy that is being pushed downwards to commercial banks but doesn't work. And maybe
yes, I'm there.
Yeah. So maybe imagine if you did literature review and you found that policy did work, maybe it worked in France. It could have worked maybe in Taiwan, but in Uganda it doesn't work. Then you realize that it may be a context matter. Yeah. And then you say, my objective is to discover why, using the inductive approach, because here it's clearly now a context issue. If it has worked elsewhere, why is it not working here? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is where the two different approaches. So again, it depends on the problem. All these things depend on the problem and the approach and what is it we're trying to look at. Now, when we're looking at qualitative, the sample size needs to be small, yeah? Because we want to go deep to understand why and to get the feelings of people and so on and so forth. It's how deep you go. It's then on the quantitative side, it's how wide you're going. I remember Eddie said last week that he wouldn't want to do quantitative research, giving so many questionnaires and so on and so forth. That would take too long. Actually, you might find out in some literature that some people believe qualitative research takes longer, much longer, because you have to spend quite a bit of time to get to understand things more and to interview people more in depth. And for example, I spent 2 years with a rural community for my research, 2 years, and my research was qualitative in nature, highly qualitative. So I spent 2 years with this community, going for their workshops, sitting through meetings. Sometimes I got so bored, I used to doze off during their workshops and so on and so forth. But in that time, I collected quite a lot of data, but I just had this one tiny community that I was doing, and specifically in healthcare, and specifically at one healthcare facility, just one healthcare facility. That was Nindia Health Center 3, just that one. And yet the implementation, the M-Track, the mobile application that was implemented nationwide. But for me, I just focused on this particular health facility, just that, for 2 years. So you can see it took a long time. It would have been quite different for another person who would have said, let me go to all the health facilities in Uganda and distribute one questionnaire. And that person would have collected data maybe in 1 month, 2 months, and they would be done. Yeah, but that would be numbers. So the difference here with the inductive, you start with observation, you develop a pattern because you're trying to understand and develop, okay, not necessarily hypothesis, but you develop assumptions, yeah, which can be tested by another researcher. And this is the beginning of a theory. So it isn't that you're developing a theory itself, but in actual sense, what you'd be reporting would be certain assumptions. You'd be making propositions at the end, saying, based on this, we believe this is this, and this is what we propose. And then another researcher would come and test your propositions. I don't know if I am making sense so far.
Yes.
I hope so. Okay. Can we use Padlet? I want to stop sharing a bit because I would like to get the participation of everyone. I would like to get everybody's participation. So you have, well, from our discussion, from the what I asked you, some of you haven't read, but I'm just going to ask you for what little you have read. I'm going to ask you, I'm just going to post in a few minutes. Give me a minute. I'm going to post for you the link. And we want to just have a brainstorm on research approaches. And I want to ask you to post what you think, what approach do you recognize? From the uploaded articles? And why you think, just tell us why. So I'm going to give you a link. So you find this in the chat room. visit that Padlet and then just post. Just post what approach you think was used in a particular article and why you think. Here, while you people are accessing that link, that Padlet, I'm going to answer some questions. I'm seeing here something from Enoch. I'm wondering how the final exam is conducted. Is it done online or physical? Objective questions or so on and so forth. Enoch, have you looked at the course outline?
Yes, I have, Doctor.
Yeah. And it says concept paper, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, so the concept paper is a take home.
Okay.
It's a take home, and you will do it and then submit your concept paper on Moodle. So I give you a period like 2-3 weeks, in which time you come up with a concept paper and you submit.
Okay.
Okay. Another question from Goretti about research on Moodle. Are we researching for both IS? Are we reading for both IS? Goretti, you can pick from anywhere you wish. I simply put for 2, just so that I can be fair to both programs. But the objective, of course, is to be able to identify some of these, to understand the research concepts, so that we understand them and we also see how they are applied. And then Ampere is saying I've clicked on Padlet and I don't know how to proceed. So let me just share. Let me share my screen. So do you all see my screen? This is my post. This is my post. Yes. I can even let me edit it to indicate who is writing. Let me add so that you know this was posted by me. I update. Now, if you want to add, do you see this plus sign? Just if you move your cursor over it and you click, you should be able to write your post here. You write the subject, you can write the subject, maybe let me write the subject, Sheba. Then I say, I can write here, I didn't read anything. Sorry. And then I publish. So, yeah. I'm seeing here a question from someone, Francis, who says, should the research we do be limited only to ICT, or we can also research on other domains like medical? Francis, can you please just clarify your question so that I can properly guide you?
Okay, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Yes, okay, to make it clear, you know, okay, I'm working with a research institution, Medical Research Council.
Yes.
And they are researching about the NCDs and HIV. So since I'm working in such a setting, is it okay for me to pose a question, a such question in that line, or it should be specific on ICT or technological?
Now, ICT or IS sits in a context. It doesn't sit, it is not separate from its contexts. Okay? It sits in a specific context. So I gave you the example of the research I did, which was ICT related. It was about designing sustainable mHealth applications. That was my research area and where my research problem was from. Designing sustainable mHealth applications. Now, mHealth, we're automatically talking about something ICT, an ICT application, but it was in the context of healthcare and specifically in the context of rural. So ICT sits somewhere. It's not, ICT or IS is not, it's not a floating entity. It sits somewhere in a certain context. So if it is in healthcare, that's where you want to research, go ahead, but you must have an ICT perspective, not a healthcare perspective. So Francis, let me ask you a question. Are you doing IS or ICT? Which program are you doing?
I'm doing IS.
IS, eh? Okay.
Yes.
So now, if it is specifically looking at IS, well, I don't know, whatever it is, if it's about system development or system design, whatever it is, it would be in the context of healthcare, but your objective should be on IS, not on healthcare.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, I'm seeing a number of posts here. Let me start with Gilbert. According to Framework for Evaluation Compliance of Public Service, the approach that would have been used is inductive. So you believe this one is qualitative research approach. Then Emmanuel and Nicholas, ICT green alignment. Said it's also an inductive approach, qualitative research. Joshua says deductive research approach for multitasking. That is true. Then Eddie says, I read both papers but only tracing the research problem. Yes, the research problem, that is, Eddie, that is true, but they don't normally mention the research approach, but you sense it. Immediately you read the paper, you sense the approach. So for example, the ICT and the information and communication, the one about groupware software application, that is clearly an inductive approach. That was a qualitative approach. And the multitasking was deductive. They even had hypothesis in there. The minute you see something like a hypothesis, that's a deductive approach. Yeah, so Cynthia also pointed out the same. Conrad says some is the approach. Conrad, what are we talking about here?
I have phrase saying it's inductive.
Oh, it was inductive. Eh? Which one are you referring to? Which paper? Dennis says that improving communication was deductive. Dennis, is that true? We can go through it later just to confirm. Okay, thank you. Thank you all for your contributions on that. That was just something to get us to see if we are picking the things that we are talking about. Now, the one thing that I don't want to leave us here thinking is that there are only two approaches. That is not true. There is a possibility to combine methods. Yeah. Sometimes it's not possible to say I'm going to take strictly one side over the other. Yeah. It's just not possible to say. You can say if there's a wealth of material, sometimes it may be easier to define a hypothesis, but if a field is new, then you really need to start from scratch. But there are situations when something is not completely new and it's also neither old as well. And this is where we use realism as our research approach. Sorry, hold on. We use realism as our research approach. So here we try to, what realism tries to do is to combine the best of both worlds, the objective side and the phenomenology side, where you try to get the independent side, but also try to get the subjective side. So take an example. Somebody might say, I'm going to carry out a survey, but I'm going to also add, I'm also going to carry out interviews with several people to get a deeper understanding of something. Yeah. So this is where somebody tries to get both realities, the realities of both worlds, to understand a situation. So those were our research approaches. The next is research strategies. Now, I really wanted to leave the research strategies or methods. Yeah, the word strategy can also be interchanged with the word method, so that we can discuss them in detail. Now, once we look at the research methods, we realize they are also directly connected to the research approaches and philosophies. Now, two research methods I would like you to read about intently, especially for those who may want to build an artifact. An artifact, I mean a system, an application, a model, a framework. These two, please read about them. They're extremely important. Those two research strategies or methods. Read about them before we have that lecture. So the next one would be the time horizon. How long do we want our research to be? For how long? Of course, certain things are dictated upon. Like, for example, when we're doing our master's dissertation, we only have a limited amount of time. So that is a cross-sectional research where we collect data for only a specific time period. Yeah, only a specific time period. Then we have a longitudinal research where we pick different times of different time periods and collect data from that time period. So I gave an example of an article I've read on BBC where there were studies done on children throughout a certain period, let's say from the time they were 1 to the time they are 5 years old. So in that time, they kept collecting bits of data to come up with maybe a development pattern or something like that. Other situations, there are people who carry out what we call secondary, they use secondary data. You've heard of organizations like Uganda Bureau of Statistics. It collects periodic data. For example, income levels for Ugandans at different times at different periods. So imagine someone was maybe studying development patterns. They can get from UBOS income levels, let's say from 2000 to 2022. That should provide a certain kind of image or trajectory of income levels and poverty levels. You may find, I don't know, I was asking a question that if UCC or NITAU collects ICT data, they say like for instance, how many domains do we have, website domains, how many data centers exist in Uganda, and so on and so forth. How many e-learning systems are currently operational in Uganda? That kind of information, like from 2000 and so on and so forth. And an ICT person can decide to use that as secondary data. That's a longitudinal study. Take an example. Faith, do you have something you want to say? Faith? Okay, Maweje, you have a question.
Doctor, it's not a question, it's a housekeeping. I think you have a command. Since you're the administrator, you have an option to mute members.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but sometimes I imagine somebody has a question, but let's move ahead. So we also have what we call research types. A research can be exploratory, descriptive, explanatory, or analytical. Now, when we say a research is exploratory, that means it's going out to discover about a phenomena which is relatively unknown. Relatively unknown. Imagine the first people who heard about COVID-19 in China. They must have had an exploratory study to find out like what is happening. People are sick. What are the symptoms? What do they present? What symptoms do they present? How long is the gestation period? What were they doing before? What were these people doing? Did they eat something? Were they in a certain environment? That was most likely an exploratory study when COVID was relatively unknown. Now, when something began to be known about COVID, then it became descriptive. Most likely when they found the virus, they wanted to find out what is its genetic makeup, how does it look like, how does it respond to this? That was descriptive. Then we came to explanatory, the explanatory side of things now. When we wanted to find out causal effects, what causes it? How is it transmitted? How can it be fought? How can it be treated? This drug has this effect. This drug has that effect, and so on and so forth. Now, as we move along the chart, we realize, I don't know if you may be seeing the relationship with the approaches and philosophies. When we are at the exploratory stage, this is the inductive side. When we need to go deep, when we need to understand the context, the first people who presented with COVID-19, someone was probably asking what was their age? Do they have any other symptom? What were they doing before? If it was a woman, what was she doing before? Did she eat something? Where did she visit? Is there anyone around her who is sick? And so on and so forth. When later on they go to find out, oh, it's a viral infection, and so on and so forth. Then when they maybe did blood tests, is it bacterial, is it viral? And then the next question is, when they found out, oh, it's a viral infection, then let's begin to describe that virus. And then they begin to find out what causes it. So as we move along the types, they also point to the research approach. When it's at the lowest bottom, exploratory, when we don't know much, that's when the research is inductive in nature. When we do know something and we want to describe something further, it lies between the two. Sometimes it may lean more to exploratory and a little bit on explanatory, going on the deductive side, a little bit on the other side. This is where somebody may decide to interview people, to have group discussions, or to sit with people and then begin to describe, and then at the end may say, let me distribute a questionnaire just to ascertain that the variables I'm seeing are actually also being picked out by a number of people. So this is where something is descriptive. Explanatory is when we begin to find the causal effects. The causal effects. This is when we begin to use theory. A theory says if this if this affects this, then it is being caused by this. If this affects this, then it's being caused by this. This is when we begin to see hypotheses beginning to appear in our research. So just the next slide simply explain this further. Find out what is happening. When we're seeking new insights, when we ask questions, when we assess a phenomena in new light. So the three ways we can conduct exploratory: we search literature, we talk to experts, we have focus group discussions. So already we can see, already when when we determine is my research exploratory. When we say we start with literature, why are we starting with literature? To find out what research has been said before about it. Ongola, this is where I want to point you back. You may have observed something, you know it doesn't work, but what have others said about it? You may find that there's a lot of research that has been done about it, and there are already assumptions. Yeah, maybe some people are saying when this policy fails, it is because maybe this was not done. And then you say, okay, if I do this, will it improve? And you go ahead and test it, and you ascertain if it's true or false, if it does actually improve. Then in that situation, you find oh yes, it may be exploratory in terms of Uganda, but elsewhere it has been done. So the importance of starting with literature. Literature is very, very important to find out what other people have done. And once you find out maybe there's been little or no research, that's when you begin to say, okay, let's talk to experts. Let's have focus group discussions. Let's have interviews. Let's observe. Yeah. Now, with exploratory research, things are very flexible and adaptable. Yeah. You go out there as a researcher with a blank space, with a blank, should I say board? Yeah, with a blank board which you're going to fill out. Ongola, you have a question.
Yes, doctor.
Yes, please.
Does that mean when I'm okay, I already in my heart know this is not working. And from what you're saying, when you say you begin research with like a blank mind of sorts,
yes,
does that mean I first drop my personal opinion that I already know?
Yes, thank you. That's a very, by the way, that's a very, very, very important thing to note, Ongola. I thank you for raising it. One of the most important things we need to do when we're doing research is to drop our opinions. Yeah, drop our opinions and feelings. I'll give you an example. I attended a PhD proposal defense, and I remember there was a student who she was doing her research on the issue of land distribution concerning Buganda and Bunyoro. Okay, land distribution considering the history between Buganda and Bunyoro. Now, and I'm not very conversant about it, but the little I do know, I think there was some land that was taken from Bunyoro because of Bunyoro's rebellion and given to Buganda because of Buganda's collaboration with the colonial leaders. So this was the area she wanted to research on. Now, as she was presenting, it became very evident that she was emotionally attached to the subject. It was quite evident. So when she was done, I remember the professors immediately advised her that we think you should change your topic because it's quite clear that you're emotionally attached to it. And why was it important? Because she was not going to be objective in what she was going to report back. Another situation, another one was this man, I think he was African, but I think clearly he had lived in America for a very long time, a black man. And his research was to trace the origins of mankind in Africa, because there was a lot of evidence. There were, okay, not a lot of evidence, but there are indications that human life began in Africa, that the earliest fossils of early man were discovered in Africa. So the proposition was that he was trying to trace if the earliest, he was trying to determine if the earliest person actually came, or humanity or civilization began from Africa. So when he presented, that was the other thing, you know, when as he was presenting, he would raise issues like, oh, you know, the Black American has been downtrodden, you know, the way the Black American has been treated in the US and so on and so forth. And immediately also the same thing was raised to him, saying this, you are emotionally attached to this subject. Therefore, you're not going to come to most likely your research findings will not be considered conclusive and objective. Yeah. So it's a key point. And let me also give you my experience also when I was doing my research. I remember I said that I spent 2 years with the community. So I remember when one of my first visits with a community, we went with a colleague who was in the health science faculty. And number one, she was white. She was a white lady. And of course, being a white lady, her experience and with Africans was unique to her. So I remember when, as soon as we arrived, we would have focus group discussions. So in the focus group discussions, the community members were supposed to raise their needs, their healthcare needs. Of course, for me, my objective was the ICT perspective, where the ICT perspective would come in. But of course, for the health facility, people were coming in to see the healthcare needs. And the community members were what in healthcare referred to as VHTs, village health teams. These are ordinary community members who provide basic healthcare in rural communities. So the healthcare needs, I remember they raised things like, oh, we need bicycles. For those of us who have motorcycles, we need fuel, you know, things like that. And I remember this lady, Lynn, at some point, Lynn came towards me and said, these people, the minute they see a donor, they start asking for money. Now you see they're asking for bicycles. Look at the person asking for a bicycle. He has a motorcycle and he's busy asking for a bicycle and so on and so forth. Now, automatically as a person, certain biases began to raise in me. Number one, there's that thing in me as an African, we know we want to beg. We know it as Africans. When you see the Mzungu, you want to beg. What can I get? And then, of course, also on the other side, there was this other part on me. It's like, this white woman, she's trying to, you know, she's undermining us. She's saying us, you know, there's that defensiveness that comes in. But immediately, I remember I had to remind myself that, you know what, Sheba, you need to be objective. This research is not about what you think, what you feel, what this white person thinks or feels. You're supposed to report back objectively. So for me, what was my objective now as a researcher was to point out the needs, the needs of these health providers that clearly pointed to their levels of poverty. They don't have a bicycle, but we are going to ask them to send SMSs, and we expect each of them to have a phone. So as a user, will they have this? So this was the context. Now, for me, I took this as an opportunity to describe the context of this user. So in other words, I had to divorce my biases. And as a researcher, you really need to think about your biases and constantly examine yourself to see where you're being biased, and you push it aside. I hope I've answered your question. Ongola, I hope I've expounded on it.
Yes, doctor. Yes, doctor.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Then with the descriptive research, here we are, like I said, we are portraying a profile or a picture of a context, an event, a situation that is otherwise may not have, we don't have a clear picture of it. Now, for example, in my research, I was giving the rural context in relation to mHealth and ICT 4D. Someone may be describing a context in Uganda that doesn't relate to the developed world. For example, we implement IS in different contexts in Uganda, yet our contexts differ greatly in terms of culture, in terms of ethics, in terms of in terms of resources, in terms of infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And yet we expect the same things to work, the very, very same things to work. So that you can find your research is descriptive in nature. Yeah. Explanatory. So explanatory, this is when you go completely, when we're trying to establish causal relationships. Yeah, causal relationships. So here is an example. Well, this graph which shows age and gross annual income, for example. Another person may decide to do a research on adoption, on anything that is looking at causal relationships to prove or disprove. So far, any question in terms of types of research? Any question? Okay. Eddie, you have a question?
Yes. You've only identified three types of research. And have I ever heard of another one called, is it applied research? Applied and basic research, actually, yes. Applied and basic research.
Okay. Now, if how can I put it? You can go further and look at things like applied research, basic research, grounded research, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, just for us not to waste time. Pardon?
Experimental, explicit de facto.
Experimental is a method.
A method.
Yeah, it's a method. Most of you are going to do applied research. Most of you, that's the research you're going to do. Neither of you are going to do basic research or grounded research. We can go into those details, but and the materials I'm going to give you actually give you more, but for the sake of not bombarding you with all the content and not giving you a chance to read some of these things, I'm going to skip over all of those. Goretti, you have a question?
Yes, Doctor, thank you so much. So in line with biasness, objectiveness, now when we come to, there's a portion where I talked about ethics as part of, I think, the research methods. Oh,
Yes.
no, sorry. There's
one of the concepts,
one of the concepts
we look about. Yeah, one of the concepts we think about.
Yes, one of the concepts we think about. But then in a time and day where we are looking at right or wrong being subjective, what are the odds that my research is going to be affected when I come across literature from literature owned by a person that is actually subjecting something to their mindset? And then my second question would be, when it comes to qualitative and quantitative research, I've noticed usually people choose one or the other. Which one would you advise someone who has a limited timeline to work with?
First and foremost, okay, the first question I didn't get very well, the first question.
Oh, no, the first question was majorly on clarifying on, okay, maybe I'm trying to understand, because we talked about some people can get personal with their research, and then
yes,
in the process they fail to be objective. But I think it also comes from a point of I'm passionate about something. I personally, as looking at doing my research, like someone was asking whether we have to major mainly in IT or we can do other fields as well. As looking at doing my research in something that is in another field, but in correlation with IT. Now, I'm passionate about that other field, really passionate. So in a time where ethics, because if we are going to measure the right or wrong, we have to look at the theories that have existed before and previous reports about those particular circumstances, right? So where right or wrong has been made something of subject, like has been made subjective, because I do remember in ethics one time we were talking about moral, immoral, and moral, right? So where right or wrong has been given a gray area, and I am driving at establishing the left and the right, is it possible that someone can end up being biased or considered biased in such a time?
Okay, now the whole purpose of research, if we go back to the definition, and if you, like I said, at the end of this lecture, I'm also going to upload certain articles. Let me tell you the words that they told me when I defended my thesis. They said, the professor said, by virtue of us passing you, you have proved beyond reasonable doubt that you have used the scientific method. You have used the scientific method at arriving at your answer. You have used the scientific method. Okay? So a method, if let's think of a method, any mathematical method. If we have I'm not a mathematician, but you think of any formula of mathematics. If it says you add this to this, you should get this. If that's the formula, then that's what it is. Whatever answer you get must be true. Not so. Yeah? If you have a formula that says, if you add this to this, then you should get this. Now, the point of research, one, you use published articles. What are published articles? These are articles that have used the scientific method. They have published them. They have been peer reviewed. By the time they've been peer reviewed, that means they have been reviewed by reviewers who are not connected to the author, and that they have said, yes, truly, this has been properly done research and it's publishable, and the work is published. If it is a dissertation, it has gone through the rigors, it has gone through professors, it has been checked for plagiarism and so on and so forth, and it's published. That means it went through the scientific process. So if something has gone through the scientific process, the answer should be devoid of the researcher, devoid of the researcher. And what do I mean? Let us say you, Goretti, Goretti, I know you're an ICT person, and you're, like you say, you're passionate. Let's say you're passionate about ICT. You know how useful it is. You know how useful ICT can be. Let us say, let us say, if I take myself as an example, I know ICT can be of great help in the teaching and learning process. I know it can support, because I've actually even taught ICT in the education sector, educational technology, where I've introduced to teachers ICT and how to use it appropriately in the teaching and learning process. So I'm quite passionate about it. But imagine now I'm a researcher who's going out to study several cases of e-learning in several universities to ascertain if there is an actual influence, if there's a positive influence to the teaching and learning process. And in the study, I find out that this is actually not the case, that it's actually been detrimental. Then Goretti, as a researcher, as much as I'm passionate about using ICT, I must objectively report that it has not been and why it has not been. Goretti, do you get my point?
Yes, doctor, thank you so much.
Yeah, that is what we mean by the objectively reporting, divorcing your feelings towards something. And another important thing, also the other important thing also I want to point out, one of the important things about using the scientific method and publishing, when you publish an article, for example, all the articles I've given you, please make time and read through. They point out the objective of their research, they point out the theories they've used, they point out the method they've used, they point out the results they used. One of the important things of pointing out this entire process is to allow somebody else, another researcher, to say, okay, let me test and see if these results are really true. I'll give you an example. Some years back, there were some researchers who let out a research claim that they found out that for people to have same-sex tendencies, it was a result of genetic makeup. Yeah, so that meant that for someone, let's say for a woman to be attracted to a woman or a man to be attracted to a man, it was a result of genetic makeup. And they published their data. They published with their methods and everything. And then other researchers replicated their research and found it to be false. Okay? They found it to be false. That is why it is important to follow the scientific method. And when you publish, to publish your scientific method clearly. That systematic inquiry that we talked about at the beginning, the systematic inquiry, it's extremely important. Okay, now it comes to your second question, Goretti. You asked, which would you advise? Yeah, which would you advise someone to use, the qualitative or quantitative approach? First thing, Goretti, is to ask, what is your research problem? What is your research problem, and what is the nature of your research problem? That's where it all begins. Okay, that's where it all begins. That's where we begin to start to say, okay, how do I begin to inquire on this subject? That is where we begin to inquire. Now, one might say, oh, because Dr. Sheba talked about doing 2 years, that was a PhD research. So don't worry. One can do a qualitative research that doesn't take as long as 2 years. And another person may take 2, 3, 4 months collecting data. Another person may rely more on interviews and observation, unlike me, who used ethnography, where I sat with these people, with the participants. Yes, Kalule, you have a question.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yes.
Doctor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, thank you so much. I would like to know, Doctor, why do we use inductive or qualitative, yet it is biased? Yet it is biased as an approach.
Thank you for that one. Now, let us talk about the biasness, the subjectivity of the researcher and the subjectivity of the participant. When we talked about subjective, we're not referring to the researcher. We're talking about the participant. Yeah? Okay. The research participant or the respondent.
Okay.
Okay. The subjectivity of the respondent. We want to know the feelings and thoughts of the participants, and we report them as is.
For example, Doctor, if I'm researching about, let's say, how these people are, for example, in Uganda, how we hold, for example, elections. If, for example, I'm talking about elections in Uganda, and I'm trying to show that I'm not on any side, but I want to come up with a solution. For example, people on the panel, you might find that some members who don't want to hear a solution that who don't want to hear you talking about things like you want to come up with a solution that would block vote reading, for example.
Yes.
So don't you think, Doctor, there might be a certain person on the panel and is like, you know what, that research, you have a feeling, you have feelings in that research, so please can you get another topic? Isn't it possible? I'm just projecting.
Now, let me put this in terms of IS. In terms of IS, imagine you're an IS researcher who is looking at an implementation of an IS system, and you took it through the rigorous tests. It works. The system actually works. The functionality works. Like now, look at the example of the action research paper. The application works. You implement it in an organization, and then you find resistance to adoption. Okay. Now, you can have the deductive approach where you test on usability and ease of use, and everything turns out correct, but the system is not being adopted. The system is not being adopted. And you say, let me take an inductive approach. And in the inductive approach, you get that feelings of people. Yeah. And you find maybe there was somebody who was expecting a bribe.
Yeah.
You find another situation, maybe there was somebody who was overlooked. Maybe there was a head ICT who was overlooked when the system was being implemented. You find another situation where you find there's somebody who is unhappy about their job. Now, as a researcher, when you're reporting back, what do you report? You report these things as is. The causes of the failure to adoption. You start outlining underlying organizational issues. Issues of corruption, poor job satisfaction, organizational politics. You point these all out as forces that are affecting adoption of IS.
Okay.
So here you're pointing out the subjective issues within the context that are not connected to you as the researcher. You, the researcher, you're divorced from it. You know the system works, you've tested it out, you know it works, but when you implement it, you point out these issues within the context that are affecting adoption. So these things are they are subjective to the research participant or the respondent, but they are not subjective to you. You on the you when you're reporting, you're not going to say these people are very corrupt, they're all bad mannered. Eh? No. You point it out in terms of academic terms. You say a culture of corruption exists in some organizations, and therefore they are expected kickbacks for adoption, and then maybe there's the existence of poor job satisfaction can also affect motivation to use a system. And then you point out organizational politics and power struggles should be managed when you're designing and implementing a system. Now you see, you realize as you're pointing them out, as you're bringing out these things, you're bringing them out objectively. They are divorced from you. Maybe you are one of the developers. You're not going to say these people just were biased about my system. But you're bringing them out in an academic way. The feelings and thoughts that are existing within the context.
I'm getting you, Doctor.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay. So we have 2 questions. Goretti. Sorry, Carola, I finished you. Goretti, you have a question?
Doctor, I'm asking something which I don't know whether other people are also asking in their minds, but I'll go ahead and ask anyway.
Yes.
We know that this track is this course is running between ICT and IS.
Yes.
Now within IS there is the AI group, there is the systems and networks group, and then there's still the structure and design group. I think. Does our research still come down to system development, or can it end in someone developing a hypothesis? Is it a thesis, a theory, or someone developing a research question? I'm just asking.
Okay, now, whether you're developing an IT solution or not, you must have a research question. Whatever the case, you should have a research question. If you're developing and going to implement a solution, why? If your research is truly going to be research, what is it you're trying to find out? What is your research question? That is the primary question. Why are you developing a system for the sake of developing it? What I want to point out is the point of doing your dissertation should not be to show your programming skills, your skills at networking and devising network solutions. No, that should not be the objective. That should not be the objective. The objective is to add new knowledge to a research community. That is the objective. Take an example, Goretti. Let us say there's somebody in networking who says, they want to develop an open source solution, because open source, there is an argument that it is more sustainable. It is there are more sustainable solutions for organizations or institutions in developing contexts. So one goes ahead and does it and implements. Now the objective there is to determine, is this really true? Is it a sustainable solution? So therefore, Goretti, I would say to that person would then say, let me look for maybe a theory, something that would help me study the sustainability of this solution in a given context or contexts. Yeah? Take an example, we've all adopted Moodle. We've all adopted Linux in our data centers. Let's say Linux in our data centers. We have adopted all these solutions, but are they truly sustainable? Someone says, maybe they design a purely open source solution, implement it in a given context, and then the objective now is to determine if it is actually sustainable. It is sustainable in terms of, do you have the technical manpower to give it support? Do you have external support for it? In case the internal organization doesn't have, is there someone goes ahead and makes a study of that. So in other words, Goretti, that person has actually developed a solution in terms of IS, but you've gone beyond just developing a solution. You now bring in a research element. Goretti, I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, you have. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Okay. Roger says, are you trying to mean that the outcome of research is dependent on findings from participants, respondents? The findings from the participants and respondents. Okay, I'm going to leave you to read about mixed methods. It's part of the materials I'm going to upload so that I don't spoon feed all the way. So I'm going to leave it at that. I want to immediately upload these articles, and if I can upload also this one. Emma, are you online? Emma, I don't know if you may help me faster than David. If I can send you the video, the recording, Zoom recording, you upload it for me on YouTube, and I share it on Moodle, most likely as soon as you send it back to me.
Okay.
Can I send it to you?
Yeah.
Okay, let's end there because it's coming. It's 7:37. So I think let's end there, and we meet tomorrow morning. Is that okay?
Time, at what time?
Yes.
Doctor?
What time did you agree on? What time did you agree? Should we start
9.
at 8 or at 9?
We haven't agreed on anything.
Okay,
Okay,
can I dictate?
Yeah.
Okay, we start at 9 a.m.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we start at 9 a.m. sharp.
Okay, make it 10.
10? Really?
Yes.
It's a Saturday, there are other things to do.
Yeah.
9 is what?
9 is okay.
9 is
okay.
10 is
10
too
is very
late.
far.
10 is
Doctor,
too
what
far.
time are we ending the
You
lectures?
find us.
What time are we ending the lectures?
At 9.
At 9. Tomorrow we start lecture at
ending.
9. Sorry?
What time are we ending?
The
From
lecture,
9 to-
let us look at 2 hours, 2.5 max.
Okay, thanks, Doctor.
Thank you too.